Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 44 of the Statecraft. I believe it's the third episode of the new season, if I remember correctly. We have got some awesome guests here today who I will introduce in a few minutes after I do some housekeeping things. So yeah, this is the Statecraft. It's a series that has historically been all about trying to share stories within the craft cannabis space in Canada to discuss what's going well with legalization, what isn't going well, and what really needs to change in order to give the smaller scale players in Canada a chance to thrive. That's kind of been a historic issue with the regulations here that's created by the big boys for the big boys with zero real consideration for the small to medium business space, which is a majority of the license holders and a majority of the growers and processors in Canada. It just happens to be that most of them are either underground or medical. These are the people that fought to legalize cannabis, and they have been kept out of the market through various policy decisions. Some probably coincidental, some probably intentional as a result of lobbying forces from people who understand the world of money and politics and lobbying and all that jazz. That's kind of why this podcast started. It was a way to bring voices to light that otherwise wouldn't be heard, to try to influence policy at local, provincial, federal levels in various ways. Yeah, after a break for roughly a year, I'll say, due to burnout because of all the policy advocacy work that we do, we are back. And this season 4, is a lot more intentional. Our focus is on actively discovering and discussing solutions with incredible stakeholders in the cannabis sector, rather. Roughly following the framework of a white paper that I wrote called The Dire State of Craft Cannabis in Canada, that really gets deeply into the myriad of challenges that are prohibiting any license holder, even on the larger scale, to really find success in the sector that we're in. At the end of the season, I'm going to work on creating an action plan that puts together all the various different solutions that get discussed with the various guests that we have here. So that's kind of the overall framework for the season. The Statecraft is sponsored by Certicraft. Certicraft's my company that I founded with Nick, who is here, and Giles, who is not here. We make the headache of Health Canada and the CRA go away for people who are licensed to produce cannabis. Our system makes all the compliance very, very, very simple and easy. And that is the only ad that you will hear this entire time. The rest of the conversation is going to be delightful conversations about compassion clubs, whether or not they should exist, if they should, what's the path forward to making it viable. The last thing I will do before introducing our guest, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, and I'll talk a little bit about the practical aspects of this platform that we're using here. Let's do the practical aspects first. So we have a chat. If you say hi in the chat, it makes it a lot more fun. If you have questions for myself or any of our guests, we have a dedicated questions tab. You can upvote questions that you like, and we will have a Q&A at the end. I think that's kind of it on the housekeeping side. I'll do a land acknowledgement and then introduce our guests. So I live in Nelson. Nelson is the traditional territories of the Sinaiaks people, through intermarriage, the Tunaha people. In this area, my first few years here, I never saw an Indigenous person, which, having lived in the downtown east side in Vancouver before that, where every other person's Indigenous, was quite a shock. And, in the downtown east side, I used to talk to lots and lots of people about their experiences, and learned a lot of horrible things about childhoods full of kidnapping and rape, and just lots of systemic violence from the church and the residency school system. really helps understand why the downtown east side is in the shape that it's in when you hear the stories of the people who are struggling there. But anyway, coming here to Nelson, everybody's basically white, and I found that confusing, given that there are First Nations here on all the land across Canada. And it took a couple years to find somebody who actually understood the story of why that was the case. And the story was the Sinixt, the stewards of this land, they are a matriarchal society, and the church did not like women in power. And matriarchal societies were the societies and the First Nations that were more likely to be murdered than the patriarchal ones, whereas patriarchal ones were more likely to be assimilated in some way, shape, or form, because the church could understand Native men in power as opposed to Native women in power. And so, yeah, there was a lot of intentional murder here in the Kootenays that took a population of thousands down to less than 10. And there being less than 10 Sinixt people left in this area is why my first few years here, I never really got to meet any of the First Nations of this land. There's a lot more horrible stuff. The story, that's like the beginning, the surface, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of the story of the Sinixt and how colonists here completely destroy their way of life. Each land acknowledgement that I do, I share different aspects of that story. That's all I will share today, and being mindful of the fact that we have a whole podcast to get into. But I like doing these longer land acknowledgements that actually have some substance behind them. I think the typical land acknowledgement that's just a check mark of this is the people who lived here before me. Done. Thank you for stewarding the land. Like, I find those so horrible. It's like, why are you thanking people that you've been murdering for stewarding the land that you have stolen? This makes no sense. At least share some of the story, and that's the first step to any kind of meaningful reconciliation, is actually understanding the story of what happened, and in some cases what's continuing to happen. And I hope wherever you are, that if you don't know the story of the First Nations on the land that you're on, I hope you take the time to learn that story, because that's the first step to any meaningful reconciliation. All right, so with that depressing note, let's shift to a different depressing note: the state of compassion clubs in Canada today. Hello, I would like to welcome our lovely guest here today. I apologize for setting that tone before introducing you, but now I'm all bubbly and jovial, and I will shift the tone quickly before I turn the stage over to you guys. Before we get into our conversation, I'd like each of you to share a brief. And when I say brief, I mean try to keep it to 1 minute. I know each of you guys have long and storied histories that we could fill an entire episode with just your history of who you are. But I'd like the episode to really focus on the future and what we can do to create a model for distribution for cannabis patients that works, because the current models that exist are not working. And when I say the current model, I mean the legal models that exist, where patients are basically being told, go to a recreational store, and then they are getting like really high THC things that do not help them, because it's not a patient framework. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves in reverse clockwise order as you show up on my screen. So I'll ask Hilary, you to introduce yourself first, then Trevor, and then Ted, if that is okay with you guys.
Thank you. First, I am a dog mom. I would say that that's like beyond my professional pedigree. To me in my life is my friends, my family, my amazing partner, fiance, but really I pretty much live for the health and happiness of dogs. And if I had all of the time and resources in the world, I would just be 100% focused on dog rescue and integrating cannabis medicines into veterinarian care. Bijou is the amazing rescue that is at my feet, taking up all of the space underneath my desk. So if I sit awkwardly, because
are you able to angle your camera for a moment so we can see?
You want to see her?
Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna have to come all the way.
This is very important.
All the way up to my desk with me. She's snoozing. She's had her breakfast and her hike.
Hi, Bijou. Oh, what a cutie.
Well, she's like, Mom, are you bugging me on Zoom again?
And you can say, no, this is Livestorm, not Zoom.
Okay, let me get you back into position here.
Thanks for that, Hilary. Could you also share briefly your connection to cannabis and your history there?
Sure. So it's a very long story. But Ted and I were just reflecting that I think we're both coming up on our 30-year anniversary of beginning our journey around supporting patients and working in medical cannabis and cannabis. So I started one of Canada's first medical cannabis dispensaries. Ted and I really got going about the same time. So as the founder of the BC Compassion Club Society. I will talk about it more later, but it was a unique organization in that we had a philanthropic integrated healthcare center in association with the cannabis distribution, which we'll chat about later because I think it's an important part of the protective bubble that we had around us and the kind of acceptance that we created. I spent 20 years doing patient advocacy, lobbying, communications, being in court, working to support other people across the country to create the same kind of organizations. And then when we got a commercial medical cannabis regulated framework in Canada, I sort of fell hard from my pedestal and decided that I wanted to go work inside the new corporate framework. I wanted to be where the power and the resources were moving to. And I actually had a really amazing run becoming the first female member of the C-suite of the Canopy Growth, which at that point was sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the marketplace. That journey ended a couple of years ago. I also took a break because I was burnt out and it had been decades of advocacy and exhaustion, and I needed to reset my nervous system. And now I run my own consulting company. And I work with cannabis companies, but I also work with other companies, like a research company, Changemark is one of the ones that I'm working with now. And I'm really focused on impact strategies, patient advocacy, sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of the good things that our friends to the south call woke these days, implementing them in terms of business strategies. How do we solve business problems using these pieces? And the trajectory is connected. The values that were the base of my Compassion Club and the Wellness Center, which is wanting to make sure that underserved populations become the center of research and healthcare systems, specifically Indigenous communities, people with mental health issues and substance use issues, that they become centered in the research and the delivery of our health systems, which is really at the heart of the good work of what Ted is still doing. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
So maybe, Ted, I'll ask you to introduce yourself next, since that's a nice segue to you and your work. And I'd rather be in flow than to force what I said we'll do earlier.
Fair enough. Well, thanks. Yeah, I when I came to Vancouver from where I grew up in Ontario 30 years ago, Hilary was already at the forefront, managing Hemp BC and helping patients. And it was 30 years ago right now that I actually moved from Vancouver, where I had come across this group called Hempology 101 and learned of some of the things happening there, and moved over to Victoria. I didn't really start my work until September of '95, but yeah, I started Hempology 101 over here. Eventually had student clubs in a number of universities and colleges, taught a free non-credit lecture series, had a couple dozen conventions in different universities, mostly University of Victoria. Wrote a book called Hempology 101, The History and Uses of Cannabis. You can find the entire book on the Cannabis Digest website, which was a newsletter that we turned into a full newspaper in 2009. So I started the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club January 1996. So we're coming up to our 30-year anniversary. We want to have a big party. I hope, Hilary, you can make it. We're going to rent a space in Victoria where we can have music and food and have a big community celebration, because to have survived 30 years under all the various circumstances is a bit of a feat. But yeah, in 2009, we turned the newspaper, turned the newsletter into a paper because Owen Smith had just been arrested. And I knew that we were going to change the laws with that court case. So I thought having our own newspaper would be a good way to help support that trial and support the industry. So that was a good run. I published that. We won the court case in 2015. Unanimous decision most people know about. A lot of people don't know. At the time, I really wasn't working in the field anymore. I was caring for my love, Gail Quinn, as she was dying of cancer. And after she passed away, I too took a break. But I came back because my club was in a dire state. Legalization was a threat in every way to our club and every other one out there we saw. And I dug my heels in for another battle. And so we've been raided 3 times since legalization. The fines were $6.5 million. They're now just 3.2. And yeah, the battle goes on.
Just 3.2 million.
In this world, that's not a lot of money, is it? Come on.
For a small nonprofit, I feel like, yeah, point taken. Thank you, Ted. I appreciate that, and I'm sure we'll chat more about the court case and kind of the current status of where things are at with the VCBC later on. The final guest to be introduced is Trevor. I'm going to just share a little preamble before I ask you to introduce yourself, Trevor. When I envisioned this talk here on compassion clubs, one pushback I keep receiving when I talk to people who share more of Health Canada's perspective on compassion clubs is the lack of pharmacists in that world. So I felt it was really critical to include a pharmacist in this conversation so that we have that perspective that is overlapping to some degree and different to some degree from a more compassion club centric model. And when I came across Trevor, I was really excited because he not only was the pharmacist, but also had his own podcast in the cannabis space and was doing advocacy work already. So I felt like this would be a perfect fit. So with that preamble shared, Trevor, I would love for you to introduce yourself as well and kind of your history with cannabis and anything else that you think is relevant for this conversation.
Thanks, Sammy. Hi, Hilary. Hi, Ted. Yeah, so 30 years ago, I was in pharmacy school. And other than having an occasional joint once in a while, I didn't think about cannabis at all. So fast forward to 2016, 2017, one of our family docs was trying to get medicinal cannabis into a care home. At that point, our pharmacy looked after 5 care homes. And so she called me up, said, here's what I want to have happen. Said, yeah, sure, no problem. Because, it's a care home. We get everything from fentanyl to chemotherapy into care homes. That's what pharmacists do. And I couldn't. There was no legal way for me to get cannabis into the care home. It just, no way, no how, couldn't do it. There was no way, which was bizarre. The weirdest thing going.
Especially if you said the fentanyl you can get in there like that.
No problem.
That's extreme.
And just so non-pharmacists, like fentanyl, it is a legit painkiller. We use it for legit pain things. It's got all sorts of other problems, but it can legitimately use for serious cancer pain. So, but yeah, getting fentanyl in there, no problem. Cannabis, no way, no how. And so I started talking to my friend Kirk, who was a nurse and been involved and interested in cannabis for the last 40 years. And after us talking about it for a little while, we thought instead of just the 2 of us talking, why don't we call up some smart people and see if they'll talk to us about cannabis? And that turned into our podcast.
Beautiful. And the podcast is Reefer Madness. Not Madness.
Reefer Madness, yes.
Madness. For those of you who are curious to check it out. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to have this discussion with you around compassion clubs and their role in Canadian society today, maybe like a relevant bit of context. There used to be many compassion clubs. Ted and Hilary here created the first two. Today, there's only one left. It's just the VCBC, Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club, that Ted runs. And there is a lot of challenge that Ted is constantly facing with that. We've had Ted before for a previous discussion on the State of Craft 2 years ago, where Ted really got into the history of compassion clubs, the history of the BCBC, and kind of a lot of the why they are the only one left, why a lot of the other people just said, you know what, this is not worth the headache anymore, and the risk and all the things that are coming along with it. And the VCBC has persevered. So Nick, can I get you to share in the chat the link to the previous podcast that we did, and then Ted, I'm curious if you can, maybe we can start with you just giving us an update on where have you arrived at. Last time you were here, you were talking about the 6 million figure. Now it's been cut in half. Like, what's the status of the legal battle with the province of BC? This is a situation where, like we heard last time, the city of Victoria wants the VCBC to be around. They've seen the statistics of how much it helps, but the provincial government is not okay with it at all. That's kind of like a very, very brief context on that. Yeah, Ted, can you give us an update on where things are at with the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, in a way. Funny enough, not a lot has happened in the last 2 years since we've chatted. There are a few updates though. I'm not sure if we had filed our injunction and lawsuit against the provincial and federal governments at that stage. It was just a bit over 2 years ago in March, I believe, that we were raided. So that was the last raid just over 2 years ago. We still haven't, knock on wood, gotten a fine for that raid. The 6.5 million we initially got was for the first 2 raids. And then last summer, they decided that the fine that they had thrown against me, because the society was given a $3.2 million fine, and in a really extraordinary case, they decided to give me an equal fine. Well, that didn't last. So last summer they dropped that. So the fines are roughly 3.2 now. And the lawsuit has been filed, and there has been some back and forth between Jack Lloyd and Kirk Tusaw, who's our lawyers, and the provincial government. But really not a lot. I think that the injunction has a lot of stages and complications to it. There's no guarantee that we'll win, but there's no guarantee that they'll win either. And the fact is that even if we lose on a technicality, the public is going to see how terrible the government has done in regards to medical marijuana. And even if we lose the injunction somehow, that doesn't even mean that our organization will cease to exist. We can just move to another location, call it another name. There's all sorts of ways to survive punitive measures. And I think they've come to realize that, on one hand, that kind of hitting the club like a whack-a-mole isn't going to change things. We've moved into our honestly our biggest, most beautiful location yet. So we've actually thrived under these circumstances. We received.
Is this the location that I connected with you at like a year or two ago, or a different?
No, you were in the back. We moved to the front of the building last year.
Okay, I've been to the front of the building too, okay. but before you guys weren't there yet. Okay, so I know exactly. That is a beautiful space.
Yeah, and so in some ways, we're struggling in that our sales aren't what they used to be, but they're enough to keep the ball rolling, and we've received a lot of support because of all the raids. Like you say, we've got the city of Victoria, not just the politicians, but the bureaucracy supporting us, to the point where we are ready. Yesterday, actually sent the rezoning application for the new space, because despite not complying with the higher levels of government. Our city sees the value in our club and is going to help us to get zoned for a cannabis retail license, even though we're not ready to get that just yet. But it'll certainly be a strong sign of support from not just our council, but from our community when we go through these public hearings and receive that from our city. And we've received other support from our city council as well. So that's been wonderful. We've got it from the research community as well. Just recently, there's been a study put out, the Conceptualizing Cannabis Harm Reduction, Lessons Learned from Cannabis Compassion Clubs and Medical Dispensaries in British Columbia, put out by Dr. Hilary Black and Heather Hobbs. This study documents not only the stark effect that legalization has had on compassion clubs and the delivery of medical marijuana in British Columbia in particular, but it also tries to reframe the discussion sort of away from medical marijuana or the substitution kind of project idea and put it squarely into the field of harm reduction, because we've been left out of that topic of discussion, and the whole harm reduction sort of movement and reaction to the toxic drug crisis has had talked about every other drug in the world, but all of a sudden, cannabis just doesn't seem to be included in there, except for another problem drug they're trying to get people off of, when it should be the opposite. So, this really is a comprehensive and in-depth study that continues to support other research that Dr. Gagnon has been doing that shows the benefit in compassion clubs and how they are superior to the existing medical legal system that patients are forced into otherwise. And so we've also even gotten support from the legal industry. There was a conference in Kelowna a couple of years ago. CertaCraft was very much a part of that. The BC Cannabis Retail Association literally, reamed Mike Farnworth out for what had been happening to our club at that point. And so to get support from, and then a year and a half ago, I received an award from the Grow Up Conference and the legal industry for my work. So, to be getting support from virtually every angle, except for a few bureaucrats in government, has meant the world to us. That's why we're still standing and continuing to do our work, because the government has seen that there are other priorities out there. And so legally, our stuff is kind of on the back burner, which in some ways is the best place for us to be right now.
Yeah. Okay, so the reason that you're even struggling with all this, like, I want to kind of bring it back to the white paper a little bit. The claim that we make in the white paper, which is backed by many facts, is that medical patients have been completely ignored by the regulations that have emerged. The compassion club model is incredibly challenged to undertake unless you are willing to deal with raids and lawsuits in the way that you guys are willing to with the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club. The framework that does exist today is very, very, very limited, is subjected to excise tax, is subjected to other forms of sales tax and whatnot, and create prohibitively expensive medicine for patients from producers whose primary focus is recreational cannabis, because it is an afterthought in the regulations. And the number of registered medical patients across Canada has dwindled by over 100,000 because they're starting to go to recreational stores where the bud tenders are not allowed, legally not allowed, to share any kind of medical advice or perspectives or suggestions. And the stuff that's being carried is ultimately coming through distribution channels from provincial distribution boards, where their focus is high THC and high THC at the expense of all the other cannabinoids. For your average medical patient isn't really going to be the most helpful thing unless it's in suppository form, which is not a format that you can get at legal recreational stores. So there's a huge gap today. There is no brick and mortar store model that exists with people who are knowledgeable in medicine, and medical patients have been forgotten. That's kind of the big crux of the argument that we make, and it's a big problem. It's a huge problem that this whole plant was legalized because of its medical benefits, and now that it's here, it's just like, it feels like just a big cash grab for, here, push this drug, in that kind of attitude, while completely ignoring all the medical side to it. the approach that you're taking, Ted, is a possible approach. It's like, this is immoral, it is wrong, so we're just going to ignore the laws and do our own thing, and we'll fight you in the courts because we believe that strongly in this. And that's a wonderful path. I'm happy to see you taking it, but most people are choosing not to do that because it comes with a huge amount of risk and challenge, and things that just some people just don't want to be putting their necks out there in that way. So I'm curious. Maybe Hilary and Trevor, I'm curious if you guys want to chime in here. What do you guys see as like alternative options to allow this gap that where medical patients' needs aren't being? Maybe first, do you agree that medical patients' needs aren't being met in Canada with the system that exists today? Maybe let's start there. Before I don't want my question to have assumptions laid into it that presuppose your opinion as well. So Hilary, let's start with you. Do you feel like this gap exists?
I think Trevor was about to say something.
Oh, or were you? Go ahead, Trevor.
Yes, I think there is absolutely a gap. We see it all the time. We have, if your typical person who comes in the pharmacy is older, so if you take your typical 75-year-old who's interested in cannabis, there's nothing wrong. Well, I like bud tenders. This is not a slam on bud tenders, but they, like you said, they're legally not supposed to be giving medical advice, and most 75-year-olds aren't feeling real comfortable about going to talk to their bud tender about medical problems. And I'm not trying to slam the doctors either, but I've definitely have doctors who someone comes in and says, hey, I'd like to try medical cannabis, and the doctor doesn't want to, can't be bothered, doesn't know how. The getting someone proper medical access to cannabis is a little bit onerous. So many of the docs are now just saying, go to your local bud tender. And then the bud tender is kind of stuck that they don't really know. Well, they're not really supposed to give medical advice, nor does your 22-year-old bud tender know anything about the medical conditions of Mrs. Jones. So it's not good. So, there's definitely a lack of education. There's a lack of education amongst healthcare professionals. Occasionally I get to talk to medical students and they still don't even know what an endocannabinoid system is. And so whether it's through a compassion club or, I'll throw my obvious bias, or through a pharmacy, right now we don't have a good place, or, maybe a dedicated medical dispensary, which weirdly, especially in BC, there seem to be everywhere pre-legalization and just don't exist anymore. But an actual place for someone to go and learn about cannabis and how it might help them with their medical condition, there isn't really good spaces for that right now.
Yeah. Okay.
I would add, just to try to be a little bit of a contrarian, that there are good bubbles. There are some specialized medical clinics that are excellent, right? Like I would have to call out Fonda Betts Greenleaf Clinic. She's been around almost as long as Ted and I have. And there are some specialized clinics that are excellent. Their doctors are highly educated. Their educators are fantastic. They work really hard to try to make affordable recommendations, but cost is the barrier, right? Like cost is such a huge barrier. Cannabis is a medicine of privileged people because we don't have insurance coverage for it. And we don't have insurance coverage for it because it's not an approved medicine. It's not an approved medicine because you can't run clinical trials on it the same way that we do with most of our approved medicines, which are single active ingredient medicines, right? Like it's this sort of complex domino effect. I have to say that it kind of breaks my heart, the situation with the lack of education and care for patients in Canada right now, in that we have decades and decades of incredible experience and education. And there are excellent pharmacists and excellent physicians and some medical licensed producers who are doing a fantastic job of continuing to focus resources on educating healthcare professionals, but it's not systemic. It's in bubbles, right? So I want to just flag two things that came up that Ted was talking about that I'd love to just make a note to circle back to, because I have some things I'd like to share about them. One is I do want to come back to talking about tax, because it is a really significant like systemic issue. And I want to talk about my history with the Compassion Club and GST and tax court. And I also want to come back to talking about harm reduction, and to talking about a research project that I'm currently engaged in that I'm hoping is going to touch on some of the holes that Ted Smith had to say. In general, around, I'm not hopeful about getting compassion clubs regulated in Canada. I gave up. I have worked on it for decades. We got the Senate to come and visit us and to write recommendations about how the compassion club model should be included in any future regulations. When the task force that was, oh, somebody's calling me. Sorry, I should have this off. The task force on legalization and regulation that was running stakeholder like meetings across the country that put together the guidance around what legalization framework should look like. They had special meetings planned with Indigenous communities and youth, but no special meetings planned with patients. So I actually collaborated with a couple of other licensed producers. We got the Arthritis Society to pay for it. We got Health Canada to agree to it. And we hosted a whole day patient engagement day for that task force. And we even got them to come to my Compassion Club, which was kind of amazing. Rumor has it that they had to get permission from the PMO's office because it was the only illegal unlicensed medical cannabis site that they came to. But we had members of that task force come, and I put them in a circle in my waiting room talking with patients while people are coming in and procuring their cannabis and hearing those conversations happening, just trying to like destigmatize and normalize. And we got that task force report to say, this is a really important model. We need to look at community-based medical cannabis regulation. And it didn't get legislated. And so, I mean, my Compassion Club, I have to say, I wasn't there for the last 5 years. It was run by another, like, that community ran that organization in the last 5 years. And it ended because of financial reasons, right? So they were never willing to shut down the wellness center. The wellness center was such a core part of the offering, having all of those integrated healthcare professionals. And that wellness center is also what I think prevented that organization from ever being rated, because it had so much integrity and authenticity with healthcare professionals and the municipal government and the provincial government. But in the end, the economics just weren't there to keep it running. The sales just weren't there because you could get cannabis all over the place, and it shut down. So my advocating around community-based distribution, which I think needs to run in parallel with pharmacy distribution, is I spend more time talking in other countries and advising people who are creating new regulatory frameworks about lessons learned from Canada, rather than actually putting my energy into trying to change the regulatory structure here, because I tried
for decades.
I tried for decades, and I also needed to find a career path where I wasn't just going to be a starving activist my whole life.
Yeah. I think that's a very reasonable choice to make. Is if you did the starving activist thing for 25 years, that's a good chunk of time of you trying that thing. Okay, that's really interesting, and yeah, we'll definitely circle back to the things that you flagged at some point in the conversation. So thank you for flagging those as things you want to come back to in the conversation. So Hilary, in terms of Canada, like, you know, you say you've given up on seeing a compassion club model emerge, a community-based wellness distribution system that you think can work. Do you see alternatives that you think are like decent, that you think are possible, or is it just you've just given up all hope?
I want to stay within the focus of this conversation. And I also want to give you a very honest answer. So I'm going to kind of go to like a 30,000 foot view for a minute. And I promise to not go far off on a tangent. in terms of any solutions to the many regulatory issues that we're facing in Canada, whether it's the overtaxation and regulation of the industry, all of the barriers that craft growers have, the regulatory framework for community-based distribution, fundamentally, and I have to say your white paper called it out in a really nice way, very, very well articulated, because I don't hear a lot of people talking about this, is we put in a huge paper when Health Canada recently did a review of the Act, and none of this was taken to heart. Again, like I literally have been writing papers and recommendations for the government for like decades. But our regulatory framework is steeped in stigma. We did not recognize the history of prohibition when we legalized cannabis. We didn't say sorry for 100 years of oppressive racist legislation that's based in misinformation and lies. We said we're going to regulate cannabis in order to reduce the harms of cannabis, right? And it's essentially regulating with a prohibitionist mentality. And so that is embedded throughout the entire regulatory framework. And it's also embedded in the attitude that most people in the Capitol Hill, in Ottawa, in our capital, they're regulating cannabis, have about the industry. The only way to solve that is to go into the root of the Cannabis Act, to add a new pillar to the fundamental purpose of the Cannabis Act, that is to recognize the history of prohibition and to work to remedy it in a whole series of ways, right? So I feel like we got a regulatory framework. It's great. People aren't going to jail as much. People aren't getting, there's not as many criminal records, but we didn't quite get it right. And systemically, that's what has to be corrected before all of these other pieces can fall into place.
And I see that being a very, very, very hard thing to correct, because in correcting that, you are now challenging the bottom line of the biggest players who benefit from this kind of a system. And within the capitalist framework that we work within, those lobbyists who have a lot of money and are like representing those biggest company interests are going to see, oh, if we go to this level with undoing stigma and trying to be fair, so to speak, and not have this prohibitionist attitude embedded into the system, now that'll allow a lot more smaller players to flourish, a lot more alternative models to flourish, which means that these massive companies would take a small hit in their bottom lines, and they operate in a way where like every reduction is a challenge. So I see that being a huge barrier to achieving this.
I disagree with you.
Cool.
And let me tell you why I disagree. From being inside the heart of a leadership team of one of the largest companies in Canada for quite a long time, the stigma inside the regulatory framework is what causes intense overtaxation and intense overregulation. The security requirements, the reporting requirements, it creates a very expensive business to run. And because the taxation is so out of control, there's barely any margins. There's barely any profitable companies, right? There's very few companies across Canada that are doing diversity work, social purpose work, good healthcare professional education, patient education, all of the stuff that I'm like so passionate about. There's a couple of gems of companies. I have to call out Rubicon Organics in BC. They do an amazing job at all of these things, and oh, big surprise, they're actually profitable. But I think that
and oh, big surprise, they're exporting a lot.
Starting exporting, they've been profitable in the Canadian market, and I think it's because they have done such. They are a loved company. But I do want to come back to Compassion Clubs, but I will say that a smart leader in even a large publicly traded licensed producer company, they know that kind of change in the regulations that does create more of a fair playing field is going to actually create the environment where companies have the capacity to thrive, because it's such a hard road to keep. That's why we've seen layoffs and companies shutting down, bankruptcies. And that attitude that you talked about was very prevalent in the early days of the licensed producers, when it was like basically a bunch of white guys that came from pharma, tobacco, alcohol, corporate finance, and mining. They wanted as many barriers as possible to keep everybody else out of the industry. And none of the folks with that attitude succeeded and have survived. So
okay, well, I appreciate you challenging me on that, because I've like, my perspective has been that attitude has remained consistent and is a big part of why a lot of things aren't really moving forward, because the biggest of players are pushing back against these kind of progressive changes that would affect that. So even the like, you worked at Canopy Growth, even in a company that large, you feel like, actually, no, they do want stigma to be changed, and to have this kind of like core shift in the act itself and the regulations and everything that follows from that.
To have a fair marketplace.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that perspective. This is also part of why I wanted you here, because you have had insider experience within those big corporations. So you have a perspective that none of the three of us do, the other people who are here. And that's hugely valuable. Cool. Ted, Trevor, do either of you guys have anything you want to add to that before I bring it back to Compassion Clubs more directly?
Yeah, a little bit. And sorry, I'm not trying to go too far off, but since we've got Hilary here, just when you're talking about, we interviewed a group called Cannabis Amnesty, Aisha Abway, and they were basically law students and people trying to get people's previous cannabis convictions removed. I'm not using the right legal term, but so Hilary, if we had something in the Cannabis Act, some kind of amnesty, wipe the state slate clean kind of thing built in there, not that what they're doing sort of as trying to do good for the world, but if that was built into the Cannabis Act, do you think that could filter down to less taxation and frankly more profitability for companies big and small?
So I haven't looked at this in a while, but Cannabis Amnesty actually stopped a bunch of their work. For when I had my hand on the tab of Canopy's goodwill money, we were actually funding Cannabis Amnesty to do a very cool project that was expungement pilot projects across the country in communities that were disproportionately impacted, in communities that were primarily Black and Brown and Indigenous. And they pulled the plug on that programming because something changed where you can apply to have possession records expunged now. And I would have to go and have a quick Google and look it up. I used to be able to speak to it. But I think that mechanism in Canada has changed now, where you, at least for possession records, there is a process to get your record cleared.
Yeah, I remember that being announced sometime in the past, like 3 or 4 years, somewhere there.
Yeah.
No, thank you. I just thought that was interesting, and not a lawyer, so I'm going to get some of this wrong, but my limited understanding of that, even though there was a process there, it still was difficult and expensive, like you said, especially if you came from BIPOC communities. It was there, but it still wasn't. The person we interviewed really thought we could have just basically taken an eraser to it, and then you said all of your it wouldn't be on the person who had the previous conviction to try to get it removed, because it was still quite a hard, even if it was a couple $100 and some paperwork, it was still quite a hurdle for a lot of people to do. But sorry, Sammy, we're going way off of your Compassion Club thing, so I'm going to really stop.
Issue.
That's okay. And what you're bringing up is marginalized communities, Trevor, and Compassion Clubs. A big part of what they do is they help marginalized communities who otherwise would not be able to have access to cannabis to have access to this medicine. So it is relevant, even if it's a bit distant in this moment.
And to tie Hilary's point into this conversation, cannabis was not legalized because of its medical value, because they felt that they were wrong in prohibiting it, that they couldn't control it. Even under Stephen Harper, we had thousands of illegal dispensaries openly operating across Canada. The cities of Victoria, Vancouver, and others were actually rezoning and licensing completely illegal dispensaries often citing Owen Smith's court case as it went towards the Supreme Court, and even after, when edibles were not available, and the local governments were at least, well, Health Canada's programs are such a failure that we recognize that these citizens have the right and justification to openly break the law, like all over the place. And that happened under Stephen Harper. And so when cannabis was made legalized, or when it was legalized, it was strictly to tax and control and regulate and get as much of that money out of the hands of the lower class and into the hands of the corporations that can control the production and supply of it. And so compassion clubs were left completely out of that, in part because of the stigma towards this, that there was never medical acceptance. Like when we won in 2015 at the Supreme Court of Canada, Rona Ambrose, who was the Minister of Health Canada, declared very loudly that she would fight this Supreme Court decision in any way that she possibly could, and that she would never recognize cannabis as medicine, like cannabis, period. And so we had this very deeply entrenched stigma against cannabis as medicine. The entire medical community almost resents the fact that the courts made this a medicine. That wasn't the medical community. It wasn't that they got a DIN number for it. The courts forced it to become medicine, and they hate that. They resent that almost entirely, because they are the medical experts, not the courts, and they can't give their power up to the courts any more than they could compassion clubs, because then all of a sudden, like, we have knowledge and control of the situation. And so it's very frustrating, and that's, as Hilary said, that's inherently a fundamental flaw that I don't think we'll ever be able to fix. We just need to address it and fight it and do everything that we can to change that.
I have a question for you guys that ties back to something you said earlier, Hilary, and to what you were just talking about, Ted, and also to our last episode that we did, which I'll link here as well, which is about cannabis stigma in the healthcare system. For me, the crux of our conversation last time, what we were talking about, is what it really boils down to is that the healthcare system today is built around a definition of medicine where a medicine is a single compound. That's you mentioned that earlier in the conversation, Hilary. That's the tie back there. To get a DIN number, a drug identification number, aka to have something be accepted by the pharmaceutical industry as medicine, it has to be a single compound. And cannabis, in its flower form or in many of its extract forms or edible forms, is never going to be that, because there are 100, give or take, cannabinoids, hundreds of terpenes, flavonoids. There's just a lot of these different compounds that all work in concert together. So it's impossible to fit into this system, and that ultimately, for cannabis to be considered medicine, that definition of medicine within the healthcare framework has to change. What you just shared, Ted, and something that you said earlier, Hilary, kind of brings me back to that same point, that's kind of the issue here that underlies everything else, ignoring the stigma part, like just talking more like logistics on a framework level, on a systems level. Would you guys agree that this is kind of a central, like, kind of tension point, that everything else stems from that?
Can I, guys, mind if I jump in?
I've asked it so that one of you would jump in, so please do.
I was at a regulators summit. Weirdly, it was in Washington, D.C. Strange time to be walking the hallowed halls of democracy. But at least the cherry blossoms were blooming. But one of my amazing clients, which is Artemis Growth Partners, and they're a private equity fund, but they are a social impact and ESG sustainability investment fund. They're investment impact investors. Very cool. It is possible for a private equity fund and like really high morals and values to be intertwined. And they
never has this sentence been said before. I'm just joking.
They just produced a regulators summit and brought together regulators from 16 different countries because they're trying to erase the silos where countries are developing medical cannabis regulations and people are repeating problems, and also not creating regulatory frameworks that work together on a global scale. And this was one of the things that we talked about. And we had like very advanced regulators and people from like standards organizations. And one of the things that we talked about was the need to create an approval process for cannabis that's based in safety data and real world evidence. Because until we create an augmented approval process for cannabis, it is never going to fit into the channels of the way that we get pharmaceutical medicines approved. And so in terms of like evolving recommendations for your white paper, that is something that hasn't been done, that nobody in the world has taken on that project. Because in my experience of working with governments, you have to do the work for them and say, here's the work, here's all the evidence, here's all the experts that put this together. Please consider implementing this. And that is a project that, again, if I had deep pockets to spend on creating regulatory solutions globally for medical cannabis access, I would work on creating an approval process based on safety data and real world evidence, and try to get it integrated into health ministries globally.
From that conference, were there any countries at all, any organizations at all that seemed really keen on making something like that happen? Or was it like, oh, this is great, but that's such a big thing, we're not going to try?
Everybody was like, that's a really great idea. Who's going to fund it? Who's going to fund the experts to come together to do that work? So it was just one of the things that got flagged, you know. And like another thing that we flagged that is kind of tangential to Compassion Clubs, but integral for patients in Canada and globally, is no country has really nailed driving legislation, right? So when we want to talk about regulatory frameworks that are embedded with stigma, the way that we criminalize patients for having cannabis in their systems when they're driving is really problematic. And there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done around creating really good evidence-based policy around the way that we manage patients who are using cannabis and driving impairment, because the rules that we have for alcohol don't work. And patients using cannabis are treated very, very differently than patients using other impairing pharmaceutical medications. Policy issues yet to be resolved.
Yeah. So circling back to Compassion Club models.
Yeah.
Hilary, I want to ask you this question again, that you went to the 30,000 foot view and then never went back to the question. Do you see there being a alternative? You said clearly, I don't think Compassion Clubs are going to be realistic in Canada, which is why I'm focusing on other countries now with the work that I've been doing. Do you see there being an alternative to Compassion Clubs that you think is viable in Canada that would allow much better patient access than there is today?
So there is a really amazing project that I'm working on. But first, I just want to acknowledge that I feel like I've been talking for a long time. And I want to make sure that like either of these lovely gentlemen, if you have something that you want to say, please, I don't want to take up all the airspace.
Well, thanks. Actually, I have an interesting model that I'd like to hear Trevor's opinion on, and Hilary's as well. But
and then I'll tell you about the project that I'm working on.
Okay. And this is something I've been considering for a while, because this whole debate about pharmacy versus Compassion Club, it has been going on for some time. Certainly, Health Canada last year recommended the pharmacy distribution model, but that's inherently problematic with this big catch-22 about the DIN number and such. And so what I see happening, what I see our club doing, whether we're being told to or not, is working towards a hybrid model where instead of having a pharmacist on site full time, because I think that's unnecessary and expensive to do, is to have a pharmacist basically on call that screens every new member that's been taken in by the club to check over the medications that they're, using to see if they're, taking blood thinners or anything else that, might have an interaction that's a concern. But also to just essentially screen, who is being allowed into the club, so that there is, a kind of a independent third party that gives it a check mark to say, okay, that's a legitimate patient. And, if they have any concerns that they want to talk to the patient about, well, then we could do that, or vice versa. If a patient comes into the club and joins the club and is like, well, gee, I'd like to talk to a doctor. I'm new to cannabis. I've never used it before. I have some concerns, then fine. But, if we got a patient that comes in that's got chronic pain, that's been using cannabis for 30 years, it's, got like 6 or 7 different issues that, knows exactly what they want to the point where they barely want to hear the intake process, then maybe a pharmacist doesn't need to be involved. Maybe, they could just come to a compassion club where they talk to someone at the counter that's got lived experience using cannabis as medicine, because that's critical, and also, some knowledge of the products, and really, for the most part, when patients have made that, connection, and that's all they need. Even if they're adjusting, the amounts of medicine that they're using, I don't know if a pharmacist would need to be involved at every stage of that. But I'd be interested to hear what Trevor has to say about that kind of a hybrid.
Partnerships like that would be fantastic. I'm just gonna, I like yours. I haven't heard exactly, but just some of the people we've talked to. We've got Rahim Dalla in the Ottawa area. His pharmacy is literally called Hybrid Farm. I'm not going to get it all. He's dabbled in a whole bunch of different things. He's had like nurse practitioners on site who can prescribe. And then there was confusion about whether or not it could actually be shipped to the pharmacy. And I know he is partnered with local cannabis shops, but he's been heavily involved in getting cannabis and pharmacy working together in the Ottawa area. And a couple entrepreneurs again.
I thought he had gone bankrupt.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where he is now, to be perfectly honest. It's been 2 years since I've done the last interview. If he went bankrupt, that's unfortunate, because he's doing so much good work. Right. And then one that we just finished interviewing, they're called Apothecare. They, Anushia, her and her partner, they're both pharmacists, and they are partnering with local cannabis shops and doing sort of basically a video call. You go into the shop. If you've got a bunch of questions for the bud tender, they'll go, okay, and if you wish, basically, here's a card. You can call our almost like you said, you're our pharmacist on call, and that's their model, is they'll do sort of a video consult with the patient of the cannabis shop. Now, a pharmacy problem, not a cannabis problem, is there's no way for a pharmacist to bill that time to any of the provincial governments. As far as I'm aware, they're all a little different. So the pharmacists were billing the patients for their time. Aside from the money stuff, that was almost like what Ted was saying. And I've wondered about that too. I have some informal relationships with some of our cannabis shops in town, where I have literally called a shop and go, Mrs. Jones is coming down and she wants exactly this. I've looked on your website. This is exactly what you can put that aside for. And they're like, oh yeah, of course. And I know they've done the same thing. Mrs. Jones has come in there and has a whole bunch on 18 medications. They'll go, why don't you go talk to Trevor at the pharmacy first, and then we'll figure something out. So having some of those relationships formalized, I think would be a great interim step, because there's some knowledge the pharmacist has of all the medications they're on and some of the medical conditions they have. And there's definitely a whole whack of knowledge in the club that, like you said, lived experience that frankly I don't have, that is really useful if it got to the patient one way or the other. So yes, some kind of hybrid like that would be fantastic.
Trevor, I have a question for you. Just a technical question. When medicines interact with one another, is that called intra? What is that called? There's a word for it.
So contraindication is a little different. Contraindication is when we shouldn't give a medicine to someone, usually because of a condition or something. And
Okay.
if the two medications interact, we just call it an interaction.
Oh, it's just called interaction. Nothing fancier than that. Okay.
So Ted, I love this idea, and we looked at it at the Compassion Club, and it was complicated by the fact that we were distributing unregulated cannabis, right? And so when you get into the system and suddenly you're making your patients go through the federal and provincial cannabis boards and you're licensed, then you are dealing with regulated cannabis, but then you have all of the barriers that are in the medical cannabis system that are why your Compassion Club needs to keep existing, right? It's like, have you ever had any, like, I know that this recent publication came out around harm reduction, but I'm wondering about program evaluation, because part of why I have broadened the scope of my focus from just focusing on cannabis and medical cannabis to focusing on research in health systems and trying to decolonize health systems essentially is I believe that if we had had better program evaluations happening in all of those decades at the Compassion Club, and we had a more solid body of data, I would have been able to use that more effectively to shape regulatory frameworks, rather than most of what I had was testimonials from the community, from patients, from physicians. And anyway, let's take it offline, Ted, because I think that the organization Changemark that I'm working with, there may be a way that we can support some program evaluation for you to create a different kind of data to continue to support your survival and your work politically.
Well, that sounds fantastic. We'll definitely chat about that.
Okay. I want to say that I haven't totally given up. I've changed my strategies and tactics. I know in the beginning I said, like, I've just totally given up. I gave up on my Compassion Club's model ever being included in the regulatory framework. That doesn't mean that I've given up on the necessity for community-based distribution and face-to-face support. So I want to talk a little bit about the community in the downtown east side in Vancouver that is the epicenter of the overdose epidemic, and the fact that the adult use framework and the medical use framework are not supporting that community. They don't have access, right? So the medical framework, they don't have fixed addresses, they don't have credit cards. It's hard to get doctors to approve you to use cannabis. You already have another substance use dependency. It just doesn't work, and it's expensive, right?
Yeah.
And then the adult use doesn't work because it's expensive, and also that community is often treated like shit when they go into medical cannabis dispensaries because they appear to be people who may be housing challenged or have mental health issues or who have symptoms of obvious substance use dependency. So there is this incredible guy, Dr. MJ Malloy, who's a professor of cannabis science at UBC and also is a lead researcher at the BC Centre of Substance Use. And he has been running these huge cohorts doing
Hilary, you just went silent.
Oh,
You're back. You're back now. You're back now. The last thing that we heard was huge cohorts, and then your audio cut out.
So I'm going to try to do this concisely. Interviewed over 10,000 people multiple times a year since the declaration of the overdose epidemic. These are people who are living with HIV and AIDS, hepatitis C. A lot of them are Indigenous folks. Some of them are youth, like all of these different cohorts. And they've been interviewing them around their relationship with cannabis and their other substance use, actually measuring the risk of overdose, like really specific overdose factors, like having a non-fatal overdose, are they injecting, are they using alone, what's the frequency of use? And they've put together this incredible body of data that is now published that shows that people who are using cannabis on a regular basis are 50% less likely to be at risk of a fatal overdose. So those of us that have been working in this space for decades, like we have helped so many people move off of alcohol and coke and speed and crack and whatever else. Like I know that Ted, you're working with those folks all the time. We see these miracles of cannabis people coming off of their alcohol addictions, but there isn't a solid body of data around cannabis as a harm reduction tool to allow us to shift how cannabis is used in the continuum of recovery, right? Like there's
you just said that this thing was published, and now you're saying there isn't a.
Well, it's beginning. This is the beginning.
Isn't until this project.
This is the beginning of the body of data that we need. But this is not clinical data. This is observational studies. So it's interviewing people about their experiences. It's not like gold standard clinical work. So what him and I are working on, and it's very early stages because we're working on getting funding for it. We're working on the regulatory pathway with Health Canada, who actually is really awesome. We want to do a pilot project in the downtown east side with a physical location, like a little tiny mini compassion club, and take a cohort of people and give them access to free regulated cannabis and be able to start measuring the statistical reduction in the likelihood of their overdose like likelihood, and to prove that it's safe, right? So this is a project that I'm working on that is a place where I do have hope, I do have faith, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it in the regulated system so that the data will be taken seriously and I can get it funded. And it is a great travesty and tragedy that we've been working for decades to create equitable access to cannabis, and the population of people that needs us the most are dying, literally. Like, sorry, it's really personal for me. Like, I have two dear girlfriends who have lost their teenagers, like, recently. And it's incredibly frustrating, the potential of cannabis as a solution for our overdose crisis, and the fact that the stigma that we're talking about and the way that the regulations have been created is people don't have access to being able to use it in the continuum of care that they need to be dealing with their substance use. So I'm gonna pause and give tissue, and I'll be right back.
Thanks, Hilary. Appreciate the perspective. Yeah, it's especially sad when you're talking about 50% reduction. That's massive. And even if it isn't clinical, if you're talking about a study across 10,000 different people where there's multiple conversations happening a year, like that's pretty statistically relevant. Like that's way beyond statistical relevancy. So I'd put a lot of faith behind this professor at UBC that's doing that work. That's really curious to kind of read that paper that was published. What were you about to say, Trevor?
Ted, I have a question for you. You are the sort of the last club standing. Do you see a way that, you know, compassion clubs could spread out across Canada, or, you know, or is it too hard? Like, it, you know, it'd be wonderful if there's a Winnipeg, you know, Cannabis Buyers Club and a Saskatoon Cannabis Buyers Club. Would there be a way forward for them that you can see, or is it too hard?
Oh, I think so. One way or another, it's as inevitable as legalization, because it's the best model, and it's just going to take us some time to get to that point. And so, you know, we have our own hopes of not only surviving, but helping to have, you know, essentially satellites of our club in other cities. And so, you know, it may be that, you know, we're somehow able to manage not only surviving, but growing and expanding, and through that process, hopefully encouraging others to open up in a similar fashion, somewhat like we did in the first place, you know, with clubs like ours, you know, doing it in a more civil disobedience kind of model that eventually becomes legitimate. Eventually, we are going to end up in court. and I would hope get an injunction and start to have some more legal protection. If and when we get to that point, it would provide some legal assurances to others to open up other clubs across Canada. And as I once did, I would just love to go and show and teach people how to do this work, because I certainly strongly believe in a decentralized system. I don't see, the best model being like, all the clubs under one roof in any way. And so, and then, and so, and I would also hope that a lot of our other problems with the supply end get dealt with over time, from the 10 milligram dosage problem to just the costs and taxes and stuff like that, so that it could be more available to patients. But yeah, I see it happening again, one way or another, even if our club does fail in court or somehow can't survive. There will always be this drive towards having stores where patients can get good information about how to use cannabis as medicine. Like that to me seems inevitable, and we might be the last country in the world to do it. But certainly every other country in the world is looking at models like that and how to do it. So yeah, it's inevitable.
Trevor, I've got a question for you. You mentioned earlier how in your introduction how you were trying to find a way to bring cannabis in for patients you were working with in a retirement home, was it?
Yeah, care home.
The care home. And that you were surprised at how hard that was, given that morphine, fentanyl, all these other things were like there was pathways for that. That was 2016, if I'm remembering correctly what you said. In your time since, it's been almost a decade since then, have you seen anything that gives you an idea that cannabis can become part of the pharmaceutical model? I shouldn't say pharmaceutical, part of the pharmacy model. Can you see that as a future that is viable in some way, shape, or form here in Canada?
Yes. So short answer, yes. We'll just use care homes for. We've got Dr. Blake Pearson in Southern Ontario, Sarnia area. He has run pilot projects with cannabis and people with dementia in care homes, sanctioned by the local health authorities. It worked great. So many fewer side effects. I won't go into all the pharmacology about how we currently treat people with dementia and how cannabis is better, but believe me, it's better. And at very least less harmful. So I really liked what Hilary said earlier about bubbles. There are definite nice bubbles of where it's going well. There are not like every problem, as you I think heard a bunch in the last episode. Healthcare is provincial, so it changes from province to province to province. The provincial body that licenses pharmacists in Manitoba does not seem to be at the moment particularly pro-cannabis. So it's, a couple of years ago, they literally sent out a communication saying, basically, thou shalt not, have any cannabis in your pharmacy, and which is fine, and that's the law. But some of my colleagues, when they read that, thought that the college was actually telling us, we can't talk to people about cannabis, which is bananas. If somebody comes into the pharmacy and says, I'm on meth and I'm worried about my dental health, how my teeth are, that is legitimately something a pharmacist can talk to them about. I know about meth. I know about the other meds you're on. I don't know as much about a dentist, but I know a little bit about dental health. I can talk about that. And no one bats an eye about me talking to someone about the interactions of their heart medications with the meth they're taking. The usual problem is they don't tell me they're on meth, and then we have a whole bunch of other issues. But, I can legitimately talk about some very illegal and very harmful substances to people, and that's fine. But it was going back to what you're saying about stigma. When this all the thou shall nots, cannabis communique came out. They didn't actually say can't talk about it, but that was immediately
it gave that sense to people.
Yes, that's immediately where the stigma was from the college or from my colleagues. I'm not blaming either, but that I had several people come, well, I guess I can't talk about it. No, that's not what it meant. But yeah, the stigma that this is bad and you shouldn't deal with it is kind of got off topic there again. But yes, I think there are some nice bubbles. We'll go back to the positive. I think there are some nice bubbles about where things are going well, but still a ways to go.
So I'm less interested in the bubbles in this moment with this question. It's more like, do you see there being a path forward anywhere in Canada where in a province, pharmacies can carry cannabis and provide that to patients?
There's been discussions. I was on a panel a couple of years about getting just CBD only products into pharmacies, and not surprising, everyone on the panel I was at thought that was a great idea. Best of my knowledge, it didn't get any further. I kind of think that Hilary might know more about because she seems to be a little more plugged in than I on the latest round of But even if Health Canada says that is great, it can go into every pharmacy, then still the provincial regulators have to say it's okay. I think they should go better. I think it's going to go well. It's just, for example, in Manitoba, I don't think it'll be real fast. My guess is, BC and Ontario will go a little faster. It's the impression I'm getting. But yeah, yes, I think it'll go. I just think we're a ways away.
Okay. Hilary, question for you. You mentioned earlier that you would talk about this thing you're working on in Canada that gives you hope. Was that the project you already talked about with the little mini? Okay, it was okay.
Yeah. I'm just looking up. I can't remember if the review board that recently reviewed the act and looked at the medical stream, if they recommended that cannabis should be put in pharmacies. Yeah, they did.
Ted mentioned that earlier. He said that earlier in this conversation that they did do that.
Yeah, they did recommend it. But again, it's complex, and it's another one of those pieces where when you're putting legislation into place, you got to get it right in the beginning, because it's very difficult to change once those statutes are in place. And I'm gonna say I'm sorry, not sorry for the emotion around talking about the toxic drug supply. And
I think it's great that you showed up how it was real for you.
But I want to suggest that you interview MJ. That's
the doctor you're talking about, or
yeah, Dr. Malloy. He's amazing, and his research is really at the forefront of the potential of cannabis as an intervention. And yeah, you should interview him. I mean, I'd be happy to connect you guys over email, but his work is phenomenal. His history is incredible. He's such a warrior for marginalized communities and drug users, and it's a wild time for that kind of research, because many of the leading researchers and organizations across the country that do research around substance use, harm reduction, things like trans health, it's all been cut by the NIH, right? Like many of you. It's the American National Institute of Health. So a lot of researchers in Canada and research organizations in Canada that research things that are not aligned with the current US administration's philosophies and policies, research funding is being cut, and it's really affecting the funding in Canada to create the bodies of data that we're talking about, to create the regulatory reform that we want to see. And he's just such a champion. And I'm feeling
I didn't realize that the NIH, the American NIH, funded Canadian research. That's news.
Global. They fund incredible research around the world, not just in America. So yeah, what Trump is doing is really affecting the power that we have to create the data that we need to, change some of these policies. And Ted, I know I already said this, but I'm feeling really fired up about trying to figure out how we can do a proper program evaluation to create another layer of impact data for you, particularly before you head back into your next round of litigation.
That would be awesome, for sure.
Ted, your path forward is very clear. Your or to me at least, it seems very clear. I'm going to like paraphrase what I see from you, and you can tell me if I'm correct with my presumptions or not. Your opinion is basically nope. Compassion clubs are necessary. The form of the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club is the form that makes the most sense to our knowledge based off our experience and what we've experimented with so far. And so we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're just going to fight the fight that we need to in order to keep it operating, because this is what we need. And so we're going to create this vision our way. Is that accurate summary of your perspective?
Oh yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Okay. Trevor, you've come at this from a perspective of trying to bring medical cannabis to patients who needed it and being stopped by the system. And so then you like entered kind of this mode of, I want to learn what's out there and figure out why this is the case, and why can I bring much more harmful medicines into patients, but not this far more benign thing that really helps and has less side effects. And I'm guessing that you'd be very interested in allowing cannabis to enter pharmacies and be able to just use it as a medicine amongst other medicines, depending on.
Yes, it'd be so much easier. Like we can get cannabis to patients, but right now it takes a bunch of hoops. You know, either the doctor has to fill the paperwork, or usually it's I fill the paperwork, the doctor signs it, then it gives the person permission to go to a licensed producer's website and fill out more forms and then have the cannabis shipped directly to them. So it works. It's just hard. Or the doctor tells the patient, you know, go to the local cannabis shop and pick something up. And they often will stop here before or after and go, was this the right thing? And so we can do it. It's just hard.
It's very complicated.
It's way too convoluted. So if it was directly something that was sold in pharmacies, that would be, again, for people I deal with are mostly older people in general, come to pharmacies anyway, talk to pharmacists anyway. It sure seems like it would be we call ourselves the most accessible health professional. It seems like that would be definitely a way for many more people to have access to cannabis for their medicinal concerns.
Yeah, and I know, like the last conversation that we had that I linked earlier in the chat, a big part of the conversation is just the challenge that emerges when a lot of doctors have this stigma and they either tell their patients, no, I'm not going to prescribe you this thing, or they say, just go to a recreational store, or both. And then they go to a recreational store and there is zero support for them to really find what they need. And you know what you just described of the full experience assumes that somebody even thinks to go into a pharmacist and ask them about this, and that the pharmacist they talk to has some understanding of cannabis and isn't stigmatized themselves. Because if any of that's true, then they're missing this experience, even if they do the steps that's needed. So clearly a lot of gaps there that needs to be bridged in some way, shape, or form. Hilary, I want to go back to something that you said in our pre-chat before we went live, which is, you know, you're talking about how important it is to have both a community-based model, compassion club, and a pharmacy-based model. Can you maybe speak to that perspective and help us understand why you think both are necessary and how you see interplay between them, if any at all?
Yeah, I mean, if I held the pen on writing medical regs for a new country or for Canada, I would definitely pen in nonprofit, community-based organizations like the one that Ted is running, like the one that I ran, and pharmacy distribution. And the reason is that medical cannabis patients cross all social economic groups, all ethnic and racial groups, and we need to create environments where everybody is comfortable. Some people are going to be way more comfortable going to talk to Ted and being in a culture and an experience that is very like pro-cannabis and cannabis friendly. Not everybody is going to be comfortable with that. Some people are going to want to go in and to be able to talk to their pharmacists. I think that like in the downtown east side, in marginalized communities and communities where we're dealing with like really high levels of homelessness and substance use issues, that both again are needed. Because if you could co-distribute cannabis with methadone or with other medications that are being used to support people with substance use issues, it would be very simple, right? You'd be able to just like give them out at the same time. And then there are some people who need the social support, right? Like the kind of time that people get when they walk into a compassion club to talk about their dog or whatever else is happening in their life outside of just their health is incredibly important and super valuable. The social network support side, and not everybody needs that or wants it.
Yeah. Awesome. Guys, we're at time here. So what I want to do just to wrap things up, I would like each of you to share the one thing that you think needs to change in order to create a reality where patients can have access to the medicine that they need. And when I say the one thing, I realize there's more than one thing that needs to change, but like the single most important thing from your perspective, what's the single thing that if it were to change, it would bring us that much closer with the biggest step possible towards a reality where medical patients have access to the medicine they need in a what's the word I'm looking for? In a dignified manner that is straightforward and easeful. Does anybody want to speak up first? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if I'm going to wave my magic wand, I'm going to get rid of stigma, because that's kind of the root of all of our problems, as far as I can tell.
Okay. Get rid of stigma. Ted, what about you?
If I could wave a magic pen, I would put one question in the final exam to get your doctor's license in Canada that asked about the endocannabinoid system. Because at this point, doctors can get licenses without knowing a single thing about it. And it would just take one question on the exam that would force them to actually look into it and learn about cannabis. So that would be my magic pen.
Which is shocking considering how massive that system is within our body, touches every part of our body, and is far more pervasive physically than most other systems in the human body. And yet, there's so little knowledge about it in the healthcare system. Hilary, what is your magic pen, magic wand?
I already said it, but I would, in Canada, I would revise the core purposes and tenets of the Cannabis Act to include what I spoke about in terms of addressing the true history of prohibition and it becoming a part of the mandate of the act to address that stigma. And there would then be specific activities regulated under the act. And while I am editing, I would also incorporate the recommendations from the Senate, the task force, the courts, and all of the numerous other expert groups who have advised that the best model to support public health in Canada is to have community-based nonprofit cannabis distribution included as one of the avenues for distribution.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for your perspectives. It's been a very enlightening conversation, and I look forward to doing some work to try to get this conversation in front of decision makers within the government. I know, James, you've been here today. You're part of the BC government. I actually don't know what you do within the BC government, but I appreciate that you've been checking out a lot of these discussions and conversations that we have, yeah, normally at this time I'd announce the next podcast, but we'll be on break for a while because I am going on a music tour. I'm going to be performing all over BC with my band Electro Jazziness, improvised electronic jazz fusion music. So yes, the next episode will be announced later in the spring sometime once we're getting closer to it being realized and me being back to work. But yeah, that's it today. Thank you guys so much. Oh, go ahead.
I said thank you.
You're welcome,
thanks, buddy. This has been really
Thanks,
fun.
Sammy.
Yeah, you guys are
It's
most
been
welcome.
nice meeting you, Trevor, and great reconnect with you, Hilary. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Nice meeting everybody. Have a good day.
Ta-ta. I'm gonna hit the end button, and James, I see you're typing. We'll still see your thing that you're typing there, even though it's oh, you're welcome. It's yeah, appreciate it. All right, bye everyone. Happy spring.